Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. My name is Teacher Alastair, and welcome to our free trial class for Wright Homeschool Academy's Conspiracies and Controversies course. The purpose of today's session is to introduce you to the course material and give you a sense for a typical class in it. On that note, if you're not planning on purchasing our asynchronous learning package and are rather interested in signing up for our live interactive classes, quick disclaimer that today's session may have a slightly different feel to it than your normal classes with us, simply because there are no other students here right now. So that means the points in class at which I ask questions would normally be responded to with students raising their hands, answering the questions, discussing. Instead, what you'll see in today's recording is I'll be putting up a 3-second timer with my fingers like this, and that should give you enough time to hit the pause button and answer the question however you see fit. So you can discuss it with a friend, speak it aloud, write it down, mull it over in your head, whatever works best for you. Also, the live interactive classes are exactly 1 hour long, though the recording you're watching today is slightly shorter, and that's because there's no student interaction. And that'll become especially apparent on the last slide in today's slideshow, because each of our live interactive classes dedicates the final 10 minutes of class time to discussion questions. The final slide has a list of discussion questions, and we give our students the opportunity to go through them in depth during that time. One final housekeeping issue: it might not be me, Teacher Alastair, actually teaching you the course, and that's because we do have several educators on our team here at Wright Homeschool Academy. So if you're interested in learning more about our educator requirements or viewing our educator profiles, all of that's on our website, and you'll find the links in the description box below. So about the course itself, as the name implies, Conspiracies and Controversies is all about covering conspiracy theories and other controversial topics. It's divided into 2 sections, each of which is 25 classes long, and each one can cover 1 or more topics ranging from campy, wacky folklore and urban legends, all the way to the deeper, darker, shocking, well-documented conspiracies. All of our material is appropriate for children. However, we do offer an adults-only version of the class for those of us who are interested in having uncensored conversations about the very thought-provoking and often polarizing topics discussed. So without further ado, let's start by looking at the course schedule. Here's the first section, the first 25 class section. So you can take a moment to pause here and take a closer look at some of the topics we'll be covering. Today's class will only be covering here the Titanic, tip of the iceberg. All right, and here is our second section, also 25 classes, lots of interesting stuff that we're going to be covering here. And with that, we're just about ready to jump into today's topic. Again, the Titanic conspiracy. So we'll be following our typical pattern where we'll look at the mainstream narrative, although that is only the tip of the iceberg, pardon the pun. And then we'll be getting into some of the alternative theories, also known as conspiracy theories. Okay, I thought this would be a good place to start. Seems like a good icebreaker, don't you think? I can't promise you that there won't be any more puns like that, guys. Okay, before we get into the Titanic itself, you've heard me say the phrase conspiracy theory about a dozen times already. We should probably define our terms. So what is a conspiracy theory? Why don't you take a moment and answer that question right now? Okay, hopefully you just told me what it means to you, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase. You didn't have to give me a dictionary definition because I've got one right here. Okay, so here it says a hypothesis alleging that the members of a coordinated group are and or were secretly working together to commit illegal or wrongful actions, including attempting to hide the existence of the group and its activities. In notable cases, the hypothesis contradicts the mainstream explanation for historical or current events. Okay, so if I could give you my own personal definition, I would say conspiracy theories go something like this. Step 1, something happens, and it's a big deal. Not like you tied your shoe, but something like a ship sank in the middle of the Atlantic and a bunch of people died. Step 2, the official story, the mainstream narrative comes out. Okay, we are told by the authorities what to think about the event, what transpired. Step 3, there is a group of people who do not believe the mainstream story for whatever reason. Maybe the mainstream story doesn't make sense. Maybe it's full of contradictions. Maybe the people who don't believe it have some privileged information that contradicts the story. Maybe they just don't trust the source, so like the government or the media. For whatever reason, they don't believe it. This leads to step 4, the conspiracy theory. Those people start to come up with their own ideas, alternative explanations or theories for what happened, for what really happened. And those are the conspiracy theories. And that's what we're going to be discussing in our classes together. So this leads me to my next question for you. What conspiracy theories have you heard of? Which ones are you familiar with? It doesn't necessarily mean which ones do you believe in, just interested to hear which ones you've heard of before. And I'm especially interested to hear whether you had heard of or been exposed to any of the conspiracy theories and controversies laid out in the course schedule. Are you looking forward to hearing about more about those and discussing them with other people? So are we. All right. Here's a funny meme for you about conspiracy theorists. Sometimes the phrase is used dismissively, as you saw in the second definition on our previous slide. Oh, that's crazy. That's just a conspiracy theory. Don't listen to him. He's just a conspiracy theorist. Well, some people would push back on that, like in this meme here. Okay, but with regards to a conspiracy, you heard in the definitions that we just gave, it involves a group of people who are essentially lying, right? They're covering up the truth. They don't want you to know the truth. But why would a group of people get together and tell a big lie? Why the lie? So this is more of a philosophical question, maybe a psychological one. But what can you guys think of as an answer to this question? Why might a group of people lie? Okay, some answers you may have come up with. They might lie to gain money. People will do a lot of bad things to get money, certainly. So perhaps it brings to mind the old expression, follow the money. They may do it to gain power or control over other people, right? This lie in some way benefits them, that it maneuvers them into a position where they can exert more control and influence in society. Maybe that's what they're after. This is what motivates them. Perhaps they are interested in gaining fame or attention. They want to be famous. They want people to listen to them, and they want to be able to tell their story, have the cameras and the spotlight on them. Some people lie for that reason. Perhaps they've committed a crime and they would like to cover up the crime. That seems like a pretty good reason to not want the truth to get out, right? If the truth is you committed a crime and perhaps you should be punished for it, seems like a surefire motivation to then cover up the crime, right? And perhaps one of the other answers you may have come up with, to advance an agenda. An agenda is like a multi-step plan. So perhaps this conspiracy, this lie, helps to advance that agenda in some way. Did you guys come up with these answers? Are there any that I've missed that you came up with? You can discuss. Of course, it can be a variety of those, right? It can be a mix. They're not mutually exclusive. All right, that being said, let's jump into the Titanic conspiracy itself. As I mentioned, the pattern we'll be following is starting with the official narrative and then the alternative explanations, aka the conspiracy theories. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the official narrative, but let's maybe just get your 5-second summary of what happened. So what do you know about the Titanic? Go. Okay, here is the most mainstream of mainstream sources, Wikipedia. This is what Wikipedia has to say about the Titanic. So the RMS, that stands for Royal Mail Service. You know, the Titanic was carrying mail along with passengers and cargo, etc. So the RMS Titanic was a British ocean liner that sank in the early hours of the 15th of April, 1912, as a result of striking an iceberg on her maiden voyage, so first time out, from Southampton, England to New York City, United States. Okay, skipping down here, of the estimated 2,224 passengers and crew aboard, approximately 1,500 died. Figures vary. Okay, let's pause here. First of all, I would argue that this is our first red flag, okay, is that we do not even have solid numbers on how many people were on board the ship and how many people died. All right, I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. but I do think that we should keep this in the back of our mind. You would expect, in other words, if the mainstream story were true, that the ship manifest, which would detail and list all of the passengers and crew members, would have been sourced to provide accurate numbers of the number of people who were on board. And then it would not be very difficult to count up how many people were alive afterwards. And then from that, you could get how many people died. I understand it might be difficult to go find bodies that are lost at sea and count them, but you can do it the other way, right? Well, we know this many people were on the ship, and this is how many people are alive now. We just did a quick attendance. Therefore, the discrepancy is the number of people who died. But the fact that the figures are varying here, in my opinion, that's what you would expect to see if the mainstream narrative were not true. So if a lot less people died than we are told, and it didn't go down the way we are told, these are the kinds of things that you would expect to see. Of course, it's not a smoking gun, it's not definitive, but it's somewhere to start. Okay, the Titanic was carrying some of the wealthiest people in the world on board. The disaster drew public attention and inspired a lasting legacy in popular culture. Indeed, probably the most obvious impact or legacy that the Titanic sinking had in popular culture would be the movie Titanic, which came out in, I think, 1998, I want to say, and was the highest grossing movie of all time, meaning it made the most money. And it held that record all the way until whenever Avatar came out, which, by the way, was also directed by the same guy, James Cameron, who directed Titanic. Maybe there's a there there. And I'll just point out that what the average person knows about the Titanic comes from the movie Titanic, at least modern people, right? It sort of kept the story alive, and not just the story and the event itself, but the mainstream version of events has been kept alive in the collective unconscious by the film. Okay, so that's the official narrative. Here's a timeline also from Wikipedia and a little map to pad out the official narrative. So you can see the ship was ordered to be built here, September of 1908. They launched the ship in May of 1911, so it took about 2.5 years to construct. They had to go through some red tape. That took another month or two. And then the maiden voyage officially began on the 10th of April. They spent a few days stopping and picking up passengers and cargo and mail, as I mentioned earlier, to get ready to leave. And finally, they leave Queenstown here in Ireland, headed for New York. Okay, and then the collision with the iceberg right here, the 14th of April, 11:40 p.m., collision with iceberg. Here, where the star is on the map, you can see the latitude and longitude coordinates are given. Now remember that, 11:40 p.m. Keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, the ship starts sinking, and by 2:20 a.m. we have foundering. Foundering is a fancy word meaning the entirety of the ship sank below the water level. So it's officially completely underwater at this point. So it took, what would that be, 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink completely under the water. And then it slowly drifted down to the seafloor from there. Okay, over the course of the next 5.5 hours, survivors were getting rescued from their lifeboats, and anybody after that who had not been rescued died. Okay, in the days and weeks following the disaster, there were 2 separate inquiries launched into the event. An inquiry is like an official investigation. So the government organizes and funds an investigation to see what happened, why, who's to blame, how can we prevent this in the future, etc. So there was one done on the US side by the Americans and another one on the other side of the pond done by the British. Okay, and I think that's relevant. That's important. Going back to the bit I pointed out on our previous slide about how the numbers of passengers and crew and dead and alive have not even been hammered out completely yet. That's suspicious given the fact that there were 2, not 1, but 2 formal official inquiries launched into the event in the days and weeks immediately following the event itself. You would think that one of their top priorities would be to figure out how many people were on board, how many people survived, how many people died. And those numbers should be among the first things that they produced, clearly. However, somehow that wasn't the case. You might also expect them to want to investigate the wreck, right? A lot of their questions about how did this happen, why, who's to blame, how can we prevent this, would probably be answered by an examination of the physical ship itself. Now, of course, it's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not easy to get to. And yet, you'll notice here that it wasn't until September of 1985. So what is that, 73 years go by before anybody actually lays eyes on the Titanic? So that's a long time to go without physically corroborating the evidence. So that's noteworthy as well. Okay, so there's the story, the timeline, the map. That's the official narrative. Now, without even leaving Wikipedia, you can find lots of alternative explanations for why did the Titanic ship sink. And I'm not going to read all of this for you. You can pause here if you like and take a look. But suffice it to say, what all of these types of theories that you see here on screen are saying is basically that there was some kind of design flaw in the Titanic, or perhaps there was like a fire or a weakness on the ship that had gone unreported. And basically, they're all trying to explain how it's possible for an iceberg to sink the Titanic. Now, why might that need explanation, you might be thinking? A ship hits a big chunk of ice in the water, a hole is ripped in the hull, water pours in, it sinks. Seems pretty natural, right? Well, one thing we have to remember about the Titanic is that it was widely advertised as the unsinkable ship, and it was specifically designed and constructed to withstand collisions with icebergs. It was the largest passenger ship ever constructed at that time. And so to hear that it was destroyed by an iceberg is especially shocking. And a lot of people can't move beyond that fact alone. We have to understand the sheer size and weight behind the Titanic. In my opinion, though, all of these theories seem to be muddying the waters a little bit. As far as I'm concerned, either the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank, or there was no iceberg and it sank for some other reason. Like, for example, it was intentionally sunk. It was sabotaged for reasons we'll discuss later. So again, I think that those types of theories are a good example of muddying the waters. Have you guys ever heard this expression before, muddying the waters? Do you know what it means? Why don't you go ahead and tell us. What does that expression mean to you? What comes to mind when you hear it? Okay, so muddying the waters it's an expression, it's an idiom. Obviously, we don't mean it literally. Here you can see a dictionary definition up on screen right here. You can, of course, pause and read it if you like. But basically, imagine this. Imagine you're walking in the forest. There's a beautiful, clear stream. You can see right down to the bottom of the stream's bed, beautiful, clear water. And then somebody annoying comes along and starts kicking up the mud at the bottom of the stream. And this mixes the mud and the water. And now all of a sudden you can't see down to the bottom of the stream anymore because they have muddied the waters. That's the literal meaning of the phrase. When we use it as an expression, what we mean is somebody is making something less clear to see or understand. Sort of like you can't see the bottom of the stream anymore. So in the context of conspiracy theories, this is when conspirators try to throw people off the trail by promoting alternative theories that are just not plausible. Okay, the idea is to cause casual investigators like you and me to throw the baby out with the bathwater, not to mix metaphors here, and dismiss all such theories as equally ridiculous. So by promoting alternative theories, such as there was a fire in the coal bunker, there was a watertight joint that was malfunctioned, et cetera, all of them serve to reinforce the existing mainstream theory, namely that there was an iceberg, that the Titanic struck, and that's what caused it to sink. But notice that none of them addressed the possibility that there was no iceberg and that the Titanic was intentionally sunk for other reasons. Okay, and the more that you casually investigate the matter, the more you'll find the kind of thing that I'm talking about right now. So let's say, for example, you're a casual investigator, just, you're yourself, and you hear that there are conspiracy theories out there about the Titanic, and you want to learn about those because you think that's interesting. You're not necessarily sold one way or the other. You go on the internet, you start typing in Titanic conspiracy theories, and then the type of stuff that pops up is, well, this is, the stuff we saw on the previous screen, or maybe stuff like this. It was the curse of a mummy on board. It was a German U-boat. The Germans sank the Titanic because reasons. It was aliens. The aliens came and did it. And you, as a rational, level-headed person, see those and you think to yourself, okay, those are a little bit outlandish. That's a little bit far-fetched and wacky. I'm not buying those. Clearly, the mainstream narrative must be true because all of the alternative theories are silly and wild and outlandish. This is one way in which people could muddy the waters. Can you guys see what I'm talking about here? So let's say, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, let's say you're the conspirator, you're the bad guy in this story, and you, for whatever reason, have sunk the Titanic intentionally with like a bomb on board or something. And then these pesky conspiracy theorists don't believe the mainstream story, the lie that you've put out there to cover up your crime. And they start coming up with alternative theories, including ones that are hitting close to home, sound a lot like the truth. Well, you might go into panic mode, damage control, and you might try to cover your tracks by promoting these other theories on the internet to make things less clear and less obvious and less easy for the casual researcher like you and me to discover the truth. Okay, hope that that's made sense. And with that, what I'd like to get into is what I think is probably the more plausible end of the spectrum in terms of the alternative theories, and not really waste any of our time on these less plausible ones. Okay, so in order to do that, let's start here. What are we looking at in these two pictures? Well, if you said that's two pictures of the same ship, I could understand why you might think that. However, if you look at the captions, you'll notice that these are actually two different, yet almost identical sister ships. One of them is the Titanic, and the other one is called the Olympic. Okay, and these dates, by the way, are the dates on which they were photographed. The Olympic was actually launched the year before in 1910, the Titanic in 1911, but they were photographed a year later. Okay, so why am I bringing this up? Why is it relevant to know that there's another ship that was built that was identical to the Titanic? Well, let me tell you about it. So the RMS Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic, were part of the White Star Line's Olympic-class ocean liners, designed to be the largest and most luxurious passenger ships of their time. Constructed by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Olympic was completed first and launched in 1910, while Titanic followed and was launched in 1911. Both ships were nearly identical in design, with only minor differences in interiors and porthole placements. You know, like some of the stamping on the parts was different, some of the carpets were different, maybe one or two rooms, the layout was different. But other than that, they were almost identical. And they were built right around the same time. In September of 1911, plot thickens, the Olympic was involved in a serious collision with the Royal Navy warship HMS Hawke, pictured here. By the way, you'll notice this is not a photograph. Well, it is a photograph of the Olympic, but the Hawke is painted in. It's a little suspicious and strange, but I'll just leave that there for you. You can look more closely if you don't believe me, which left a significant gash in her hull. Though the ship was repaired, the incident led to costly delays, cha-ching, and suspicions that her structural integrity had been compromised. Cha-ching. Okay, let's pause here. Imagine that you own White Star Lines, the company that is building these ships, and you spend a ton of money, invest a ton of money into building these two big, beautiful ships, the biggest, most beautiful ships that the world had ever seen up to that point, okay? And you are sure that your investment is going to pay off. And why wouldn't it? There are lots of people going back and forth across the Atlantic from the US to Europe. Airplanes hadn't been invented yet, so going by ship was the only way. And there are lots of rich people out there and they want to go on the nicest ship possible, and that's yours. Okay? Now, before you can even start to recoup your investment by selling tickets on your ship gets into a big accident. Uh-oh. Immediately, that's bad news. It's worse news that it was your ship captain's fault. We'll see that that was the case. So that means the insurance company is not going to pay out. They only pay if it's not your fault, right? But it was your ship captain's fault. His mismaneuvering of this unwieldy giant ship caused the accident. So not only do you have to shell out more money to pay for the repairs on your ship and the RMS or HMS Hawk, that's bad enough. But now the situation's getting even worse because people are starting to talk. Ooh, did you hear about what happened to the Olympic? Yeah, I heard that it got in a big accident and it's not seaworthy anymore. It's not ship shape. Oh boy, I wouldn't pay top dollar to sail on that ship. It could easily sink. This is bad news for you because now people are not going to buy tickets to go on your ship. And you've poured a boatload of money into them. Okay, hopefully we're all on board there, and I'll finish reading now. This gave rise to the popular Olympic switch conspiracy theory, which claims that the damaged Olympic was secretly swapped with the Titanic and intentionally sunk in 1912 as part of an insurance scam. According to the theory, the Olympic, disguised as the Titanic, was sent on the doomed voyage while the real Titanic remained in service under the name Olympic. Okay, so you send out, you as the owner of White Star Lines, you've spent a ton of money, you're not going to be able to recoup your investment. What's the solution here? I know, send out the Olympic, pretend it's the Titanic, and then sink it in the middle of the ocean. Now your damaged ship is gone. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And the insurance company is going to pay you, right? Because that was a perfectly fine ship out there. That was the Titanic, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, not the Olympic. And now the insurance company has to pay full price, full premium. And they're paying because it wasn't your fault. Oops, it hit an iceberg. That's in insurance lingo titled an act of God. It's called an act of God. It's not your fault. And therefore the insurance company pays out. And now you, as the owner of White Star Line, recoup your full investment that you had paid for in the insurance, and you still have one perfectly good ship that is available for use. So that could be a potential way, potential motivation, let's say, for the owner of the ship to intentionally sink the Titanic. All right. Now, let's put some faces to names here. We keep talking about this hypothetical owner of White Star Lines. Who is this shadowy figure? If indeed he is the culprit behind the conspiracy, perhaps he bears mentioning and discussing, right? So here's a portrait of him. Does anybody recognize who this is? Okay, well, if you said J.P. Morgan, congratulations, you're right. So let's talk about him, the Fed, and the Olympic switch. You'll notice here there's a newspaper cartoon depicting him as an octopus gobbling up all the important industries in the US. And underneath that is another newspaper headline discussing the introduction of the Federal Reserve System in the United States, which is the central banking system which controls the financial system in the United States. Okay, how are all of these things related? Well, they're all tied together through this guy, J.P. Morgan. Let me tell you a bit about him and the situation. So J.P. Morgan was one of the most powerful financiers. That's like an investor. So he's already really wealthy. He uses his money to invest in things so that his money makes money. So he's one of the biggest and most powerful ones of the early 20th century. That's the 1900s. We're talking about Titanic era, controlling vast sectors of American industry and banking through his firm, J.P. Morgan & Co. Today it's called J.P. Morgan Chase & Co. And that vast control is what's being depicted here by J.P. Morgan, the octopus. As part of his growing influence in international commerce, Morgan acquired the White Star Line in 1902 through his conglomerate, the International Mercantile Marine Company. Okay, so hopefully we're all following here. The Olympic and Titanic are owned by White Star Line. White Star Line is owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company. The International Mercantile Marine Company is owned by J.P. Morgan. Now, this ownership placed him at the center of decisions surrounding the Olympic-class liners, including the ill-fated Titanic. Popular conspiracy theory suggests that the Titanic sinking was part of a calculated scheme orchestrated by Morgan to serve two purposes: to eliminate wealthy opponents of the U.S. Federal Reserve System and to collect insurance money on a failing vessel. Okay, so we've already covered this part, right? We understand how it would be good business sense to collect insurance money on a vessel that nobody wants to pay tickets for. But about this part, the U.S. Federal Reserve System had not been implemented yet. It only existed in theory. It had been designed but not formally passed by law. And part of the reason for that, for the delay, is that there were several powerful, influential figures who opposed the Federal Reserve System. They did not like the idea of concentrating all of that financial control into a few hands. Okay, so according to the theory, Morgan had the older, damaged Olympic disguised as the brand new Titanic and sent her out to sea on a doomed voyage with plans to sink the ship and frame it as an accident. Conveniently, Morgan himself had booked a luxurious suite aboard the Titanic, but abruptly canceled his trip just before departure, citing health concerns. Though he was later seen vacationing in France. Adding to suspicions, 3 influential businessmen who allegedly opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve, John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, all perished in the disaster. Okay, guys, so this is like a 2-for-1 for JP Morgan, right? If you're him and you've got two big problems in your life right now. Number one, you just poured a bunch of money into the Olympic, or the Titanic and Olympic, and one of them has been severely damaged, and you're worried you're not going to get money back on that investment. Number two, you are trying to pass the Federal Reserve Act in the US so that you can have control over the finances there, and there are a lot of people opposing it. Well, the Titanic sinking in the middle of the Atlantic, carrying all of the opponents to your plans, seems to be a big win for JP Morgan, right? He's the only one coming out ahead. And that's the way we kind of need to think about it, right? This is the way that a criminal investigator would approach the situation. They would say, who benefits? Cui bono in Latin. And I think we can all agree that JP Morgan definitely benefited from the sinking of the Titanic. All right. Now, for the next portion of class, what we're going to do is I'm going to bring up a few other snippets from the mainstream account, and I'm going to point out to you some fishy details I found along the way. I'm not going to give you an exact breakdown or blueprint of what I think happened. I'll leave it up to you to decide, but I'm just going to poke some holes in the mainstream narrative here and illustrate again that if the mainstream narrative were true, are these the kinds of details we would expect to see, or are these the kinds of details we'd expect to see if it weren't true? And of course, the point that I'm making as we go through is the latter. So let's start with the crew and passengers. Here's E.J. Smith, by the way, the captain of the Titanic, who was responsible for the crash between the Olympic and the Hawk before. So right away, you can already see that if the conspiracy theory is true, you can imagine a scenario where JP Morgan sat down with Captain E.J. Smith and said, hey, look, we, the White Star Line, are in a bit of a bind. We're in a bad situation because of what you did. It's your fault. You crashed the ship. Nobody wants to get on it now. So you owe us, right? You can see how Captain E.J. Smith would owe them big time. They kept him employed in his position as captain, and yet he cost them a lot of money. So he would be honor bound to pay them back. So perhaps they convinced him to be involved in the conspiracy. Of course, if the conspiracy theory were true, you would expect that the captain would have been in on it. And we already have a motivation, a reason for him to be. And of course, they said to him, but don't worry, Captain E.J. Smith, we'll paint you as a hero in the story, the fake story that we sell to the masses about this event. You will be the heroic captain who refused a seat on the lifeboats, allowing the women and children to go first, and you went down with the ship. And everybody will remember you as a self-sacrificial hero. In reality, though, don't worry, we'll have a ship standing off to the side and we'll spirit you away in the night. You'll change your identity. Nobody will be suspecting that. Nobody will be looking for you because they will think that you're dead. And you can just, I don't know, shave your beard, change your name, move to another place, and start a new life. It would be as simple as that. Okay. About the other crew and passengers here, it says that the vast majority of crew members aboard the Titanic were only casual workers who would only come aboard the ship a few hours before sailing from Southampton. This is the official story, again, coming right out of Wikipedia, and you can follow their links for where they're getting this. Doesn't that seem a little strange to you, that the Titanic, this supposedly luxurious, top-of-the-line ocean liner, didn't have a dedicated crew? They just picked up random people who happened to be on the docks of Southampton right before they set sail on their maiden voyage. Is that the kind of thing you would expect if this were a true story? I suspect not. Okay, how about this? Did you know that the Titanic was not fully booked? It was not up to its full capacity when it went on its only voyage. and in fact that it was about half full, that in and of itself is a strange detail. Usually, as it says right here, the Titanic could expect to be fully booked on its maiden voyage. There's a lot of advertisement, a lot of hype. You know, if you're an investor and you build one of these ships, you definitely want to make sure that your first voyage brings in a lot of revenue, right? Because you're out a lot of money that you need to get back. So you advertise and say, the Titanic is coming. It's going to be the biggest and best ship ever. And normally the Titanic, you would expect it would be totally booked. Why wasn't it? Why was it only half full? Well, they say it's because there was a national coal strike on the go at the time, coal being the type of fuel that was used for ships at that time. So that means that there were a lot of ships that were no longer making the crossing from Europe, like the UK, to the Americas. Okay, but let's pause and just think critically about that for a second. Does that make sense? Think about that for a second. I'll give you 3 seconds here. Okay, here's what my problem with it. Wouldn't that have the opposite effect? Think about it. If there are less ships making the crossing from the UK to the Americas, and still the same number of people who are looking to make that crossing, don't you think that the ships like the Titanic that are actually going and making the crossing because they have the coal, don't you expect those to be even more full than they would normally be rather than less full? So this detail, this excuse for why the Titanic wasn't full, doesn't seem to hold any water for me. I don't know about you. Okay, let's move on from there and talk about some more fishy details. In this instance, we'll be talking about the lifeboats. So not only was the Titanic only half full, but they say that the Titanic only had enough lifeboats to carry about half of those people who were on board. So a little basic math would tell you that if the Titanic were completely booked, totally full, then they would have only had enough lifeboats for a quarter of the people, right? Well, 2 problems with that. First of all, that seems absurd. Why would they not have enough lifeboats for everybody on board? And second of all, why is the math wrong on Wikipedia? They say if the Titanic were full, then they would have only had enough for a third of the people. The math isn't mathing there. That's a minor detail, but it's a little odd. Again, these kinds of things, they slowly add up. We have to take them all in total rather than just one thing at a time. Okay, more weird stuff about these lifeboats. They say that the crew had not been trained on how to use the lifeboats properly. The officers did not know how many people could be put into the lifeboats, and so they launched a lot of the lifeboats barely half full. So this kind of explains, again, why a lot of people allegedly died in the water. Not enough lifeboats, even though the ship wasn't full. The crew didn't know how to use them properly or how many people could fit in them, and so they did it wrong, and therefore there were people stuck without lifeboats. That's what we're told. So, in my opinion, this is more evidence that the story is not true. These things do not ring true. They're not believable. They strain credulity. It's not what you would expect. Okay, down here, speaking of the actual people that died, I thought this was kind of interesting. I was looking at this on Wikipedia, and they say, yeah, so the average lifeboat capacity was only filled up to about 60%. They said here 706 people survived the disaster, and 1,517 people died. Okay, finally, we get some solid numbers, right? Well, immediately after I took this clipping, somebody edited the Wikipedia page, and now it reads like this. The number of survivors have been variously reported as between 705 and 708, and it is generally accepted that approximately 1,500 persons died in the disaster. Why the sudden change, and why are we back to these strange, vague, unconfirmed numbers? It seems like they can't get their story straight, which is exactly what you would expect if the story were not true. And a lot less people died than they said. All right, how about the insurance? We've already discussed how the Titanic conspiracy could have been a giant insurance scam, right? JP Morgan and the other owners of White Star Lines decided that they wanted to recoup the loss on their investment by getting the insurance company to pay out. Well, if that was the case, how did that turn out for them? Well, it turned out swimmingly. Lloyd's, that's the insurance company that insured the Titanic, paid the White Star Line the full sum owed to them within 30 days. And when we're talking about a sum, an amount of money, that the Titanic was worth, that's a huge sum. So to be paid out that amount in 30 days is lightning fast. Boom, they immediately get full payout. Well, other passengers aboard the Titanic started to say, well, hang on a second. If there's insurance payouts going around, well, don't we deserve some? And so that's when they said, no, you guys don't get anything. Only about 27% of the total sought by survivors was actually paid to them. So huge payout for White Star Line, peanuts for the other passengers aboard. And the reason is they say, well, it wasn't our fault. The causes of the ship sinking were largely unforeseeable rather than due to negligence. Nope, not our fault. Therefore, insurance company pays us big money and we don't have to give you barely anything at all. Okay, so that worked out pretty well. Again, cui bono, who benefits, looks like White Star Line. Okay, let's talk about the bodies. What are we looking at here in this grainy old real photograph? You're looking at an unmarked mass grave of allegedly the deceased from the disaster. Why are these coffins unmarked? Well, that's because allegedly the bodies are unidentified, and that's why they're being buried in this mass grave. That seems a little strange, don't you think? How is it possible that they weren't able to identify these people? And when you look into the story even further, it becomes stranger and stranger. Let's take a look. So, the disaster occurs. People are aware of it. The massive loss of life has become known. And now they decide it's time to send out a search and rescue party. Not for survivors. There aren't, all the survivors have been picked up already. They're talking about recovering the bodies that have been lost at sea, right? So that they're not just floating out there in the Atlantic to be eaten by sharks. Instead, they're going to get picked up and brought home and given a proper burial for their friends and family, right? So far, so good. Makes perfect sense. They say that they recovered 333 victims doing this. Okay, but here's where it gets weird. So they go out there. Remember, they know exactly what they're getting into. The massive loss of life had already become known. They go out there and they start hauling in bodies. This is the story we're told. They start hauling bodies into their rescue ships. And then they say to themselves, this is too many bodies. We can't take all of these back. What? Why? They already knew what they were getting into. The massive loss of life became known. Then they decide, okay, we're only going to take some of them back. Which ones are we going to preserve? How about only the bodies of first-class passengers? Strange, strange decision. Guys, how would they know which of the passengers were first class? It's not like the dead bodies floating in the water are holding their ticket stub in hand, that says first class admittance. So how would they know? Well, they say that they identified them by their clothing. Identified them by their clothing. Okay, but who remembers what time of day was it when the Titanic struck the iceberg, allegedly, and sank? What time of day was it? It was around midnight, right? It was like 11:40 p.m., and then it sank over the course of the next 2 hours and 40 minutes till 2:20 a.m. So guys, what kind of clothing are people wearing in the middle of the night? Well, if you said pajamas, I think you'd be correct. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about these people go out there, they start hauling bodies in, and they are only preserving the bodies wearing the fanciest pajamas. That's the official story, okay? I'm not making this up. Don't look at me. That's the official story. That's what they say. I find that very strange. How about you? What did they do with all the other passengers, you may ask? They say they were buried at sea, which is a euphemism. It's a nice way of saying they dumped the bodies back overboard. So they hauled them in. They said, nope, these pajamas aren't fancy enough. Boom, dumped them back overboard and only took the first class passengers back with them. Okay, if you say so. So of those bodies that they actually brought back, allegedly 333, after they finished dumping all the not fancy enough pajama wearing people back into the ocean, of those, only about 2/3 were identified. That means fully a third of them, what would that be, about 111 of them roughly, were still unidentified. So that's what you saw, those people getting buried in these mass graves. How is that possible? How is it possible that even after selecting for only the high class, first class passengers, high income, high status people, that these bodies are still unidentified. You're telling me that a rich person dies by sinking on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, and nobody from his circle of family or friends makes the trip to go identify his body and recover the body and give a proper burial? Over 100 of them are just left there to be buried in a mass grave. Does that seem plausible to you? Is that what you would do if one of your family members died, God forbid, in a tragic accident? I don't think so. So to me, that stands out as fishy. How about you? Okay, let's talk about the iceberg itself. And in order to do that, we should talk about the Gulf Stream. Have you guys heard of this before? Okay, warm and swift Atlantic Ocean current. Okay, guys, what you're looking at here, this is North America, right? Here's Canada up here. This is the US over here. There's Florida down there. And the water is colored. Blue is really cold. Red is really warm. And then, yellow is also warm. Green is still pretty warm. We're talking about it's like 15 degrees Celsius, I think. So, I mean, it's not like I wouldn't go swimming in it, but it's not like you would freeze to death immediately in it. And also, why is there an iceberg in there? The iceberg was right around here, right on the edge of where the Gulf Stream touches the rest of the Atlantic. So why was there a gigantic iceberg, large enough allegedly to sink the Titanic, floating around in the Gulf Stream? Take a look, compare these two maps. Talking about an iceberg that would have been right in the Gulf Stream. And remember, well, who remembers? Tell us right now, when did the Titanic sink? Like, what time of year was it? Yeah, that's right. It was in April 12th, right? Or April, yeah, or the night of the 14th. So we're not talking about the depths of winter or something. We're talking about springtime. Also, take a look at the latitude, 41 degrees north. Not only is that in the Gulf Stream, but just think about some cities that are at 41 degrees north latitude. So like New York, New York. How about Madrid, Spain? How about Rome, Italy? These are all right around 41 degrees north latitude. Do you think that in the middle of April, in the middle of spring, you could be in one of those cities looking out across the ocean and seeing a gigantic iceberg floating by at your latitude? Of course not. It seems extremely unlikely that there would have been an iceberg there in the first place, is my point. Okay, if you want to learn more about that, don't take my word for it. I recommend following this link right here to the National Snow and Ice Database Center, I think it's called. And you can see all of the data. You can download all these huge data sets which show you the places in which you can find icebergs at any given time of year, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, though, normally you find icebergs in these big red rectangles. So near Antarctica and then up here in the Arctic Circle. If you look at the Titanic iceberg, it's like right on the line here. So we're talking about like a freak iceberg that's just outside of the normal place where you would find one. It's in the middle of spring in the Gulf Stream, and it's big enough to sink the Titanic. I'm saying I find that fishy. I don't know about you. Okay, one other thing. I mentioned earlier that if the conspiracy theory were true, then the captain would have to be in on it, right? He has to be involved in some way. And that's exactly what you can see here. Take a look at these links. These links are all hyperlinked right here on the slide. You can follow this link right here to take a look at all of them. And would it surprise you to learn that Captain E.J. Smith was seen alive and well in the weeks following the disaster in which he supposedly died? And it was reported in 1, 2, 3, 4 different major newspapers. The Washington Times, Washington Herald, New York Times reported on this, that Captain Smith was spotted alive. A guy who recognized him went up and spoke with him and was freaked out by the whole thing because he thought the captain was dead, obviously. So again, these are the kinds of things that you would expect to see if the story were fake and not if it were real. All right, if you want to learn more about the ins and outs and technical details of how it would be possible to switch the Titanic and Olympic, this is a good documentary. You can follow this link right here to check it out. I won't go into all the nitty-gritty details. It's like a 2-hour documentary. And I'll just point out that this documentary in particular is extremely focused on only the Titanic Olympic switch. It doesn't really get into the insurance fraud or the lack of an iceberg or anything like that. But this does at least give you enough information for one part of the puzzle. Okay, so at this stage, this is where we would discuss everything that we covered in today's class. So I'll just put up the discussion questions, and you guys can pause once they're all up on screen and take your time answering the questions at your leisure. So here's the first. Do you think the mainstream narrative is plausible? Why or why not? Who would benefit from a disaster like the sinking of the Titanic? If it were a conspiracy, who would have to be quote unquote in on it? Which details stood out to you? What do you want to learn more about? Which theories do you think are plausible? Which aren't, and why? Okay, so I'll give you guys 3 seconds there to answer those questions. Okay, so that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much for coming. Just a reminder that all the links for the website and everything else are in the description box below, including where to register for the course long term. And from all of us here at Wright Homeschool Academy, we look forward to getting in touch with you, learning together, and we'll see you in class.